No animal changed the speed of history more completely. Before the horse, an army moved at the pace of a marching soldier. A message traveled only as fast as a man could walk. The horizon of any civilization was measured in days of foot travel in every direction. And then, in a moment that researchers are still arguing about, someone, somewhere, climbed onto the back of a wild horse and did not fall off. Or perhaps they didn't climb at first. Perhaps it began with a rope, a fence, a foal separated from its herd and raised close to a fire. However it began, what followed was the most consequential human-animal partnership in the history of warfare, migration, trade, and empire. The horse carried the Indo-Europeans across Eurasia. It carried the Mongols from the steppe to the gates of Vienna. It carried messages across continents before the telegraph existed. It reshaped agriculture, hunting, and the geometry of political power across the entire ancient world. And for a long time, we believed we knew where that partnership began. Then ancient DNA arrived. And the story, already one of the most debated in all of human prehistory, became something far more complicated, far more surprising, and far more ancient than anyone had fully prepared for. The accepted narrative had been assembled carefully over more than a century of archaeology, linguistics, and early genetic work. Horses were domesticated on the Eurasian steppe. That much was broadly agreed upon. The question was where on that vast, featureless grassland the first domestication event occurred, and when. By the early 2000s, a leading candidate had emerged, the Butai culture, a group of hunter-gatherers living in what is now northern Kazakhstan, roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. The Butai site offered compelling evidence. There were corrals, enclosures made of posts, suggesting that horses were being penned rather than simply hunted. There were ceramic vessels with lipid residues that chemical analysis suggested were consistent with fermented mare's milk. And there were horse bones, thousands of them, in proportions and with characteristics that looked more like a managed herd than a hunted prey population. It seemed decisive. The Butai had domesticated the horse. From Kazakhstan, the practice spread, westward into Europe, southward into the Near East, eastward into China. The timeline matched the spread of chariot technology, the dispersal of Indo-European languages, the rise of the steppe pastoralist cultures that would eventually reshape the entire Old World. Linguists pointed to reconstructed Proto-Indo-European vocabulary, ancient root words for wheel, axle, and horse that suggested a steppe origin. Archaeologists pointed to the Yamnaya culture, expanding from the Pontic steppe around 5,000 years ago, as the vector by which domesticated horses and their riders entered Europe. Everything seemed to converge. And then the DNA of the Butai horses was sequenced. The first crack in the Butai narrative came not from a new excavation but from a genetic comparison. When researchers extracted and sequenced ancient DNA from Butai horse specimens and compared it against the genomes of modern domestic horses, they found something that the archaeological story had not predicted. Modern domestic horses, the breeds that carry the legacy of every cavalry charge, every agricultural plow, every racing tradition across human history, did not descend from the Butai horses. Not in any meaningful way. The Butai horses were genetically distinct. They represented a lineage that, rather than spreading outward to become the ancestor of modern domesticated breeds, had instead contributed ancestry primarily to a surprising modern population, the Przewalski's horse, long considered the last truly wild horse on Earth. The animal that researchers had held up as a window into the pre-domestication past was not, as it turned out, a wild horse in the way everyone had assumed. It was the descendant of a domestication event that had effectively been reversed, feral Butai horses, or their descendants, that had returned to the wild over the millennia following the collapse of the Butai culture. The Butai people had domesticated horses. But their horses were not our horses. That was not a minor revision. That was the collapse of a consensus. Ancient DNA entered the horse origin debate with full force through a series of large-scale studies conducted during the 2010s and into the 2020s. The methods were by this point well established in archaeogenomics, extraction of ancient genetic material from teeth and bone fragments, followed by whole genome sequencing and comparison against reference populations spanning thousands of years and dozens of geographic regions. For horse research, the ancient DNA record was particularly rich. Horses appeared in enormous numbers at archaeological sites across the steppe, and their bones were well preserved by the cold and dry conditions that characterized much of the Eurasian grassland. Researchers could build a timeline of horse genetic diversity stretching back tens of thousands of years, before domestication, through the transition, and into the historical period, with a resolution that simply was not possible for most other domesticated species. What that timeline showed was astonishing and deeply destabilizing. The diversity of wild horse populations in pre-domestic Eurasia had been enormous. Different genetic lineages occupied different parts of the steppe, the forests, the river valleys, and the mountain margins. Some of those lineages persisted for thousands of years. Others vanished. And then, in the genomic record, something happened, a dramatic contraction of diversity, a sharp reduction in the number of distinct lineages that researchers began to recognize as the genetic signature of a domestication event. But the location of that contraction was not Kazakhstan. If this kind of science, the kind that appends the most settled answers, is what keeps you watching, subscribe. Because this story has further to go. The conflict that deepened through the late 2010s and into the 2020s was about geography, but it was really about something more fundamental. Whether domestication was a single event with a single origin, or whether the modern domestic horse was the product of something more complicated. The ancient DNA showed that wild horse populations across Eurasia had been genetically diverse and geographically structured for tens of thousands of years before domestication. The Butai horses represented one regional lineage. But there were other lineages, in the western Eurasian steppe, in the forests of Eastern Europe, in the Iberian Peninsula, each with their own genetic profile. As researchers traced the ancestry of modern domestic horses backward through time, the signal kept pointing not toward Kazakhstan, not toward the eastern steppe, but toward the western steppe, the region stretching from the lower Volga and Don river systems into the Pontic grasslands north of the Black Sea. That was the Yamnaya heartland. The same region that ancient DNA studies of human populations had already identified as the source of the massive Bronze Age expansion that reshaped European and South Asian populations around 5,000 years ago. The horses and the humans pointed to the same place. The same time. The same transformation. But the mechanism, exactly how, exactly when, exactly among which people, remained fiercely debated. Three frameworks competed to explain what the ancient equine genomes were revealing. The first proposed a single domestication event in the western Eurasian steppe, roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, among the cultures associated with the Yamnaya or their immediate predecessors. Under this model, a small founding population of wild horses in the Pontic-Caspian steppe region was domesticated, rapidly selected for trainability and endurance, and then spread explosively across Eurasia as the steppe cultures expanded. The genetic bottleneck visible in ancient DNA, the dramatic reduction in diversity that preceded the spread of modern domestic lineages, reflected this single founding event and its rapid propagation. All modern domestic horses, from Arabian thoroughbreds to Mongolian steppe horses, trace their ancestry back to this one moment, in one place, among one culture. The second framework allowed for the Butai event as a real but ultimately failed domestication, an independent taming of horses in Kazakhstan that produced a genuine working relationship between humans and horses but whose genetic legacy was not carried forward into the modern domestic lineage. Under this model, domestication happened at least twice, once in the east, producing the Butai horses whose descendants eventually went feral and became Przewalski's horses, and once in the west, producing the ancestors of every horse alive in human civilization today. The question of why the Western domestication succeeded globally while the Eastern one did not became itself a subject of investigation, pointing toward differences in the horses themselves, or in the cultures that domesticated them, or in the historical accidents that determined which populations expanded and which collapsed. The third framework was more diffuse, that the transition from wild to domestic was not a discrete event but a process, spread across centuries and across a broad geographic zone of the steppe, in which multiple local populations of wild horses were gradually incorporated into human management systems, mixing and interbreeding until a single, relatively homogeneous domestic population emerged from the genetic churning. Under this model, the bottleneck visible in the ancient DNA was not the signature of a single founding event but of a selective sweep, a rapid spread of horses with particular behavioral traits, particularly reduced flight response and increased tolerance of human contact, that outcompete other lineages across the entire steppe in a matter of centuries. The study that came closest to settling the question, though it left important threads still unresolved, was published in 2021 by a large international team that assembled the most comprehensive ancient horse genome dataset ever constructed. The team analyzed the genomes of over 200 ancient horses spanning a time range from before the last ice age through the historical period, drawn from sites across Europe, Central Asia, the Middle East, and East Asia. Their central finding was striking in its geographic specificity. The origin of modern domestic horses traced back, with high statistical confidence, to a population located in the Pontic-Caspian steppe region, specifically the area around the lower Volga and Don rivers, dating to approximately 4,000 to 4,500 years before the present. This was not the Buddha. This was a different culture, a different region, a different lineage of wild horses. The team identified two key genetic changes that appeared in the founding domestic population and spread rapidly across Eurasia with the expansion of domesticated horses, variants associated with stronger spinal ligaments, an adaptation that would make horses more capable of bearing riders and loads, and variants associated with reduced reactivity, a calmer behavioral profile that made the animals more manageable under pressure. The horses that spread across Eurasia and changed history were not simply tamed. They were, in a very real genetic sense, redesigned. Selected for the specific traits that made the human-horse partnership viable at scale. Not the horses researchers had been studying. Not the region the Butai hypothesis had pointed toward. The deepest twist in the horse's genomic story is not about which culture first climbed onto a horse's back. It is about what happened to every other wild horse population when the domestic lineage began to spread. The ancient DNA shows a pattern of replacement so thorough it borders on erasure. Before domestication, wild horse populations across Eurasia were diverse. Genetically distinct lineages occupied different geographic zones, each shaped by thousands of years of local adaptation. After the spread of the domestic lineage from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, those populations disappeared. Not slowly, rapidly. Within a few centuries of the domestic horse's expansion, the genomic signatures of pre-domestic wild horse populations vanish almost entirely from the archaeological record outside the Butai lineage. They were not simply absorbed through admixture. They were replaced, their ranges taken over by domestic horses and their descendants, their genetic legacy reduced to trace signals in a handful of later specimens. The genome preserved what the steppe grass swallowed. An entire world of wild horse diversity, tens of thousands of years of divergence, reduced to near nothing in the span of a few human generations. The speed of that replacement is itself a signal. It suggests that the domestic horse was not simply a tamed wild horse. It was something functionally new, an animal whose partnership with humans gave it an advantage so overwhelming that it swept across the continent like a wave, carrying its riders and their cultures with it. What the horse genome ultimately reveals is a lesson about the relationship between biological change and historical transformation. The domestication of the horse was not simply a cultural event, a human decision that then played out in history. It was a genetic event, a behavioral reshaping of an animal that produced a new kind of partnership, and that new partnership then reshaped the genetic landscape of the horse itself, the cultural landscape of every human society it touched, and the political geography of an entire hemisphere. The spread of the domestic horse is inseparable from the spread of Indo-European languages across Eurasia, from the rise of the steppe empires, from the transformation of warfare, from the acceleration of trade networks that connected civilizations previously separated by geography too vast for foot travel to overcome. The horse did not just carry people. It carried ideas, languages, technologies, diseases, and genes, human genes, across distances that had previously been impassable at the speeds that empire requires. To understand where the horse came from is, in a deep sense, to understand where much of the modern world came from. Picture the Pontic steppe in the spring, perhaps 4,500 years ago. The grass has just turned green after the long winter. The sky is enormous, that particular enormity that open grassland produces, where the horizon seems to curve away in every direction and the clouds cast shadows that move across the land like living things. A river catches the morning light somewhere to the south. And at the edge of a shallow valley, a small herd of horses grazes in the early warmth. Not the refined animals that history will eventually carry across the world. Stockier, shorter, more cautious. Their heads come up at the sound of something approaching from upwind, and then, after a moment, they settle again. The approaching figure is not a threat. Not anymore. Not after however many generations of careful, incremental trust building that brought things to this point. The rider who approaches is not performing history. He does not know that the animal he is reaching toward will, within 1,000 years, carry his descendants to the shores of the Atlantic and the banks of the Industry. He knows only the individual horse in front of him, the grass under his feet, and the particular quality of this morning's light. The genome of every horse alive today carries that moment, that valley, that light, that careful approach across the grass. The question of where horses were truly domesticated is no longer as simple as pointing to a map. The Bhutai proved that domestication could happen without transforming the world, that taming an animal was not the same as forging a partnership capable of reshaping civilizations. The Pontic-Caspian origin of modern domestic horses suggests that what mattered was not merely the act of domestication but the specific genetic and cultural context in which it occurred, the particular horses, the particular people, the particular moment in human prehistory when a partnership of that kind could explode across an entire hemisphere. The ancient DNA has not closed the question. Researchers continue to debate the precise timing, the exact cultural group responsible, the degree to which multiple wild populations contributed to the founding domestic lineage. The map is still being drawn. But what the genome has already given us is something more valuable than a single origin point. It has given us a picture of a transformation, biological, cultural, and historical, that happened faster, spread further, and erased more of what came before than any previous model had suggested. The horse did not simply enter human history. It accelerated it. And the genome preserved, in its compressed and ancient archive, the record of that acceleration, the vanished wild lineages, the founding bottleneck, the selected traits that made partnership possible, the explosive spread across a continent that would never move at walking pace again. The old story was too small for what actually happened. Subscribe if you want more stories from the deep archive, the ones where the evidence rewrites everything we thought we knew about how the world became what it is.